So I'm making my way through the Scream series. I rewatched part 3 last night, and it definitely reminded me why this is the weakest film in the series. So let's talk about it. So in Scream 3, the killer is showing up to kill off the remaining survivors of the Woodsboro murders, as well as the cast members of the movie Stab 3, which is the movie within the movie that is the second sequel to the movie based off the first movie. And if that sounds as confusing and as meta as you think, it is entirely intended to be exactly that. So in doing so, they must pull Sidney Prescott out of hiding to investigate the real history of her mother and her ties to Hollywood and the real motivations of the killer in all of these films. And if that sounds really convoluted and complex, it is. And if it sounds like that's going to rob some of the fun and the horror out of the series, it does. There's still the charm of the series here, but it feels a little bit been there, done that. It feels a little bit too much like they're digging where there's not much to dig up and we're just rehashing things a little bit. And so this definitely comes off like the weakest film in the series, while still being fun. But before I go into my full review, this video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. It's a way that you can directly support my channel financially. If you really like what I'm doing, want to help me keep doing it and support what I'm doing, you can go on to that website. The link's down below. Support my channel that way, financially. And my Patreon supporters, each month I ask them if there's anything they want me to review. I try and do as many of those as I can. Cody Leach asked me a couple of months ago to review my favorite scary movie. That is Scream. So I started reviewing this entire series. In just a few weeks, I'm going to do Scream 4 as well as rank all the movies in the Scream series because he asked. But if you're a fan of my series, like I said, consider supporting my channel on there. And if you do so, maybe I can review whatever your selected movie is of the month. You can check out who my other, I don't know where that is, patron supporters are. I really do appreciate what they do. And maybe you can join them in that. With all that said, let's dive in and start talking about the good about this movie. So, right off the bat, just these movies have a tone that I enjoy. The vibe, the pacing, the way they're structured, they're self-referential, they're just interesting. So the idea that the movie revolves around a movie within a movie that's a sequel to the movie, all that weird, convoluted stuff, it's interesting, and it's fun the way that they're playing off things in an interesting way. And it's making commentary a lot on pop culture and the way that we do treat these sorts of crimes, especially if you don't, like, if you're old enough, you remember the 90s, there were a lot of these high-profile trials, the O.J. Simpson trial, the Menendez brothers, several of these different ones where killers essentially became superstars by being killers. And this was all kind of predated reality television taking over the way it does. And so it almost feels ahead of its time in the way some of this treats some of the elements and of how these sorts of things are handled and the way they're turned into movies and all that fun stuff. And John Benet Ramsey and Amy Fisher and all these stories from the 90s that kind of set the stage for this type of movie. It just makes for an intriguing, fun viewing. Along the same lines, the cast, you've grown to love these characters by this point in time and kind of the way they have a certain rapport around them. Wes Craven, the director, of course, is a master of terror, and so when the scary slasher elements of it happen, he, of course, is a master of that type of thing, so they're fun, exhilarating, scary at times with the right types of jump scares, the wrong types of jump scares, but being fun about it, and all sorts of elements of that nature. Along the same lines, they find new, different takes on the material and kind of having this, going further into the meta aspects while having two versions of each of the characters, because you have the actor version of each of the characters in it, interacting back and forth with themselves, creating a fun new kind of twist on some of the stuff. There's some new interesting characters like Patrick Dempsey, a fresh, young-faced Patrick Dempsey before Grey's Anatomy, before Enchanted. Here he is in this movie as a police detective, which is kind of like weird casting because you don't think hardened police detective man when you think about him. And then you like I said, you find some ways to still surprise you in who gets killed, when they get killed, how they get killed, all that fun stuff. And once again, having that mystery that's been throughout each of these movies of who is the killer, why are they doing it, what are we trying to discover. So there's a lot of things in here that are good. And just in general, this formula of movie that they've created here, I enjoy. That's it for the good. Let's move on to the bad. And this movie, you can just tell that they didn't have a good idea how to keep things going. So they were just trying harder, like, okay, what's the most meta thing we can do is we'll actually make this movie take place on the stage, actually in Hollywood, in the home of Sidney Prescott that's the one built in a studio, and all sorts of stuff that just seems so forced and heavy-handed. Once again, because the previous films, each of them tied back to Sidney Prescott and her murdered mother and different people connected to it. It felt like they just had to kind of cram that in here. And so this leads to this subplot about the real history of Sidney's mother and what they didn't know and what nobody knew up to this point in time, that really bogs down the middle act where they're interviewing Hollywood producers about stuff and who is her mother, and then they go and track down files on her and where pictures of her were taken and all sorts of stuff like that, that just the investigation part of it gets so heavy-handed in like trying to discover something about a character that we're not actually interested in. We've never actually met Sidney's mother. She was killed off a year before the first movie took place. So the idea that we're trying to discover who she is, it's not all that interesting. And it just feels like we're forcing it because we have to have a new reveal. There has to be more drama. So it just turns into soap opera, melodrama, that forced kind of have the big reveal of who it is, very soap opera-esque. Along the same lines, the kills felt a lot more mundane, like they didn't have a good idea of a new way to do something clever. So there's just a lot of people getting stabbed in the back. Like that's kind of it. Happened multiple times in the movie. The intro to this one, where they try to have the big shocking intro to each one of these movies, the first one having maybe the best opening to any horror movie of all time. I probably would contend it is the best intro to any horror movie of all time and one of the best intros to a movie maybe ever. Second one has a great follow-up, not as good as the original, but it doesn't need to be. It's just a worthy follow-up. This one doesn't feel as worthy. It's not a bad sequence, just the bar was so set so high, and you can tell they were trying to find a way that was as powerful as those ones. I don't think they pulled it off as well, so it just was like, okay, that's another intro. And then they introduce a bunch of characters in the beginning that we don't know, that we know they're just going to get killed off pretty soon. And then we have to get to our old characters that are surviving. We have some cameos from some dead people coming into the movie. So it felt like we're a little spread thin on the cast in spending time with everybody. With the way the story plays out, Sidney doesn't really join the story until about halfway through the movie. And you can feel something's missing in that because we're not tracking along with our lead character as the story's progressing. So that was a bit odd, and the way it ended up playing out. And then even into the final reveals of the third act, in one sense, they're consistent with the previous movies, and they're pretty ridiculous and over the top in the reveals in all of these movies. But here it just feels like we have to come up with another one of these ones. And so it feels as if by this movie, while subverting horror cliches of other movies, it's just living into the cliches that they've created for themselves. That's kind of what this movie felt like watching through it. And even where they tried to kind of point out the cliches in third films and trilogies, it like you can't just get away with doing cliche things if you point it out. And that's what this movie felt a little bit like, where they have a character, I don't want to spoil too much in case you haven't seen it, come back from the dead and kind of tell them some stuff on what normally happens in third movies and trilogies, as basically an excuse to do these sorts of things that just start to strain plausibility, strain credibility, and you're watching going like, we're going a little bit too far. Some of the things that in the previous two films were like, we're stretching plausibility here, goes way further down the line in this film. And to the point that it just, you notice that stuff too much. And it's not as fun or as funny as the previous movies. So all in all, the package just isn't quite as strong as before. It feels played out. The reveals feel a lot more forced. Wes Craven's still great at this, and I gotta say, I have some nostalgia for the soundtrack on this one. I bought the soundtrack for this movie whenever it came out, and it's a bunch of new metal from the year 2000 that I was listening to at the time. And it's new metal, NU with an umlaut metal. All these drop D, drop C, drop B, songs that I listen to excessively, and 2 Creed songs, one of them being an exclusive track that wasn't on any of their albums that I listened to a lot back in the year 2000. All in all, it's a pretty watchable movie for me, but I can't say it's a good movie. There's just a lot of things I was noticing about it. And if I'm going to watch a Scream movie, I'm going to watch any of the other ones over this one. I basically, the only times I watch this one are when I'm just watching through it kind of as homework, whereas 1 and 2 I just put in because I like both of those movies for what they bring to the table. This one's just kind of like, oh yeah, there's more Scream that has more reveals, that gives me more backstory that I'm not all that interested in. So at the end of the day, I gotta say, I can't really recommend it. I'd give it a 5.5, just underneath my recommendation line at 6. Watchable movie, I don't really recommend. If this is your kind of thing, you might like it more than I do, but it's by far the weakest film in the series, so I just gotta go under recommended on it, unfortunately. And if I'm being honest, I'm pretty torn on that one. I want to go higher just because I love the series so much and I want you to watch it, but if I'm being honest, I think higher than that, and I'm not really telling you what I really feel about it. So anyway, that's my take on it. How about you? Tell me what you thought about it down below in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you're a fan of the series and kind of going through these reviews with me, tell me what you thought about it. Or if you're new to the series and watching through it for the first time, love to hear your thoughts as well. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, ranking videos. Coming up in a few weeks, I'll probably be ranking the Scream series, so that'll be a lot of fun. But I don't want to just talk about movies. I want to talk about movies with you. So join me in the comment section, have a lively discussion, and thank you for watching.